The sea was unnaturally calm that night, a polished sheet of black glass stretching toward a horizon swallowed by fog. Somewhere beneath it, engines whispered at low power, carrying men who officially did not exist. Their mission had no name that would ever appear in reports, no medals waiting at the end, no promise of survival. By 1944, the world believed it understood the shape of the war. Front lines were drawn, alliances were fixed. The end felt visible, even if distant. But beyond the headlines and battlefield maps, entire operations were unfolding in silence, designed not to win territory, but to erase something far more dangerous. The orders were simple. Reach a remote coastal facility long scrubbed from public records. Secure whatever remained inside. Leave nothing behind. No flags, no witnesses. What intelligence suggested was buried there had the potential to shift the balance of post-war power. Not weapons in the traditional sense, but knowledge. Research too unstable, too morally compromised, too catastrophic to fall into enemy hands. The men involved were chosen for one reason. If the mission failed, the world would never know it had existed. As their vessel slipped closer to shore, distant lights flickered behind cliffs that weren't marked on any military map. A storm rolled in faster than forecast. Communications began to fracture, and beneath the tension ran a darker realization. If what they were sent to retrieve truly existed, it meant someone had already crossed a line the war was never supposed to reach. A line so dangerous it had to be buried forever. But what happens when a secret meant to disappear refuses to stay hidden? The facility had once been a research compound disguised as a weather station. From the air, it appeared harmless. From the inside, it was something else entirely. Intelligence files later sealed for decades described experiments that blurred the boundary between military necessity and human expendability. Prisoners of war, political captives, civilians who vanished from occupied towns without explanation. The research focused on accelerated biological collapse. Ways to dismantle the human body faster than conventional weapons ever could. Disease was not the goal. Control was. If perfected, a single deployment could cripple cities without destroying infrastructure. An invisible victory. By late 1944, Allied analysts realized fragments of this work had already been transferred elsewhere. What remained in the coastal compound were prototypes, data archives, and test results deemed too volatile to move quickly. The classified mission was launched not to capture the site. It was meant to neutralize it. But secrecy bred urgency, and urgency bred mistakes. Local resistance fighters were never informed. Naval escorts were reduced to avoid detection. The extraction window was narrowed to hours. Inside the compound, signs of rushed evacuation were everywhere. Burned documents still smoldered, equipment smashed but not destroyed, and beneath the main laboratory floor, a sealed chamber remained untouched. When the team forced it open, they found preserved samples still viable, proof the research hadn't been abandoned. It had simply gone underground. The realization struck too late. Alarms began to wail across the cliffs. Searchlights cut through the fog. The mission that was supposed to disappear had just announced its presence to the world. Gunfire echoed through concrete corridors as enemy patrols converged on the compound. The extraction point offshore was already under threat. The team split, some securing evidence, others attempting to rig the remaining labs for destruction. But the sealed chamber had been compromised. A containment failure spread through the lower levels, unseen and unstoppable. Within minutes, soldiers, both Allied and Axis, began collapsing with violent symptoms no weapon had ever produced. Breathing seized, muscles locked, skin mottled with darkening veins. No one understood what had been released, only that it was lethal. The mission unraveled into chaos. Boats never reached shore. Radio transmissions cut out mid-sentence. By dawn, the compound was silent again. Later reconnaissance flights would report nothing but scorched earth and collapsed tunnels where the facility once stood. Officially, the destruction was attributed to a bombing raid. Unofficially, there were no survivors to tell the truth. What had been meant as a surgical operation became a biological disaster erased by secrecy. Fragments of the research were never recovered. Some analysts believed rival powers obtained portions before the collapse. Others feared samples still lay buried beneath the ruins, preserved by the cold coastal rock. The war moved forward, but something irreversible had already happened. The world had glimpsed a weapon that redefined destruction, not through explosions, but through invisible suffering. And no one could be certain it was gone. In the years after the war, classified investigations quietly resurfaced the mission under code names that would later be redacted into blank pages. Witness accounts from nearby villages describe soldiers falling ill overnight, entire patrols disappearing without gunfire, areas sealed off by occupying forces long after combat had passed. Every official inquiry ended the same way: insufficient evidence. Records destroyed. National security. Yet within newly formed intelligence agencies, the incident reshaped policy. Biological research became both aggressively pursued and aggressively hidden. International treaties were drafted not out of humanitarian awakening, but out of fear. Fear that someone somewhere already possessed what had been unleashed that night. Some scientists who once worked near the original program resurfaced in post-war laboratories across different nations, carrying knowledge no one could publicly acknowledge. Cold War bioweapons programs didn't emerge from imagination. They emerged from what had nearly escaped control in the final months of World War II. The classified mission faded into obscurity, buried beneath victories, surrender documents, and reconstruction narratives. But its shadow stretched across decades of military secrecy. Because the most dangerous legacy of war is not what is remembered. It is what is hidden. And somewhere beneath forgotten cliffs and sealed archives lies proof that humanity came closer than anyone was ever told to a form of warfare that leaves no ruins, only silence. Some secrets aren't lost to history. They are deliberately entombed, waiting for the day they are discovered again. For decades, the mission existed only as a pattern of absences. Files that should have been routine were missing entire years. Naval logs skipped coordinates along that stretch of coast. Intelligence briefings referenced operations that ended mid-paragraph, as if history itself had been interrupted. The silence was not accidental. Post-war investigators who attempted to trace the incident encountered walls built not of bureaucracy, but of deliberate erasure. Orders stamped beyond the highest classification levels. Witness statements quietly withdrawn, medical reports refiled under unrelated outbreaks. What troubled analysts most was not what had been destroyed. It was what had been protected. Certain research documents, partial, fragmented, but unmistakably related, resurfaced within emerging Cold War laboratories across multiple countries. Each version was incomplete. Each hinted at a larger original body of work that no longer existed in one place. It suggested coordination, not to preserve the truth, but to divide it. By scattering fragments of the research across nations, no single power could fully reconstruct what had once been created. It was containment through dispersion, a silent agreement forged not by diplomacy, but by shared terror of what had nearly escaped. Yet secrecy has a flaw. It requires human memory, and memory fades unevenly. Retired officers began giving interviews decades later, carefully choosing words, describing operations that went wrong, experiments that should never have been attempted, and losses that weren't from combat. None named the mission, but every description pointed to the same shadow. Even the language of international bioweapon conventions reflected the fear born from that night. Clauses about accidental release, about deniability, about catastrophic spread beyond intended targets. They were not theoretical concerns. They were lessons written in bodies that never made the news. The world moved on, believing chemical weapons were the ultimate unseen threat. But those who knew the truth understood something worse had already existed, and might still. The most unsettling possibility was never the original experiment. It was what came after. Modern intelligence assessments, still partially classified today, quietly acknowledged unexplained outbreaks in post-war years that bore eerie similarities to the symptoms recorded at the destroyed compound. Sudden respiratory failure, rapid neurological collapse, entire clusters of illness with no identifiable pathogen. Each was officially attributed to natural causes. Each vanished from investigation just as quickly. Some historians now believe the coastal facility wasn't the end of the research program. It was a prototype, a test run. The data recovered, however fragmented, was enough to inspire decades of covert biological experimentation under different flags, different budgets, and different justifications. What began as a desperate wartime project evolved into a hidden arms race where success could never be publicly claimed, because acknowledging it meant admitting the weapon existed and that it had already been used. The classified mission's true failure wasn't the loss of life or the collapse of the facility. It was that the knowledge survived. Warfare had crossed into a realm where victory no longer required destruction, only infection, only silence, only time. Unlike bombs, these weapons left no cities to photograph, no rubble to rebuild, no clear moment of catastrophe, just gradual disappearance and plausible deniability. The men who launched the mission believed they were burying a horror. In reality, they may have scattered its seeds across the world. Today, the original location remains sealed under layers of restricted access and environmental warnings that never quite explain what they're protecting. The war that created the secret is long over, but the consequences never ended, because the most powerful weapons are not the ones that explode. They are the ones no one is allowed to admit exist. And once humanity learns how to erase itself quietly, that knowledge can never truly be destroyed.